Chapter 6, Dangerous Timing, Day 3. Entering the defense classroom by himself was perhaps a bad sign about this evening's lesson. When Harry had finished his dinner he'd given Sirius a glance, but the eldest black son had easily ignored him. Perhaps it was best that Alice had appeared to distract Lily, as Sirius seemed eager to keep tonight's event quiet. Harry found himself heading to defense on his own. For a moment, considering his tension with the defense professor, he almost decided to wait until a third party was present. But if anything, Harry wasn't a coward, and bearing the possibility that Barton was a Death Eater, well then he didn't really have anything to fear. Of course, considering that two of his previous defense professors had been in league with Voldemort, perhaps his odds weren't too good. Good evening, Mr. Tempest. I see you've beat Mr. Black. Barton was seated at his desk. A pile of essays were beside him. He'd been grading. Seeing Barton like this was somehow less intimidating. The man had shed his robe, was dressed in slacks and a simple muggle t-shirt. Evening, Harry replied. I was somewhat surprised when Mr. Black confirmed that you would be willing to help him. You don't seem fond of the Unforgivables. He didn't look up as he spoke. Instead he marked a grade on one of the essays with a flourish, moving on to the next one. Well, who does like them? Harry allowed carefully. Barton looked up. Yes, I suppose you're right. Harry scratched his neck uncomfortably. I don't know how much use I can be, he found himself saying. Barton paused again. He tapped the current essay with his quill. I said much of the same to Mr. Black. But he seems convinced that you will be able to help him. And I'll admit, having someone who can successfully break the curse may be encouraging if nothing else. Silence fell between them. The only noise was the scratching of the quill. Harry found himself looking at the clock, wondering how much after dinner Sirius was planning on waiting. Mr. Tempest, Barton said suddenly. I do want to talk about class today. Harry's teeth ground together. Yes? He asked with false curiosity. If Barton wanted him to apologize about leaving class, well then the defense professor would be disappointed. Harry could stand a lot of things, he'd gotten good at it. But he didn't feel bad about his actions today. The Cruciatus curse, you didn't want to discuss it because you've felt the effects. Am I right? Barton was looking at him straight on now, reading his body language like a book. Harry nodded. Barton raised a hand, rubbed the bridge of his nose. Your description of the curse was very accurate. I'd hoped you'd merely found a good reference book, or perhaps had witnessed some incident. But when you refused to speak, well, I feared such might have been the case. The professor watched him. Harry found himself meeting the man's gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, which was a relief. In that case, the professor said slowly, I am sorry about class today. I suppose I wanted to think that someone of your age wouldn't have felt the effects of that curse. But perhaps that is not the world we live in. Harry nodded. Thanks. No problem, the man smiled. But if anyone asks, you met with me tonight as part of your detention. A grin quirked at his lips. Yes, Professor. Barton looked at the clock. Now where is Mr. Black? It was his idea to come asking for lessons, wasn't it? He probably has to arrange some way to ditch his friends, Harry explained thoughtfully. Barton nodded. You may be right. I've been warned about that bunch, thicker than thieves, or so the other professors would have me believe. But if that were the case, then why would the young Mr. Black feel the need to keep this secret? Barton cocked an eyebrow in Harry's direction. The young time traveler had realized that the defense professor was very observant, but it was then that a flushed Sirius Black entered the room. Sorry, he huffed, breathing deeply. It was you who wanted these lessons, was it not? Barton said with a harsh tone. Yes, sir, Sirius grumbled. If you're planning on behaving this way, why not cancel the whole thing? Barton threatened. No, sir, I want to learn. Sirius's voice took on a forceful tone. He stood straighter and stared the professor in the eye. Barton paused. All right then, provided you are not wasting Mr. Tempest's time, and more importantly my time, then we shall proceed. The Imperious curse is all a matter of willpower, although some have argued that long-term exposure to the curse can also build up a resistance. Barton was still seated in his desk, but he spoke like a teacher giving a lecture. Now, as I've told you, Mr. Black, this may not be something you can learn, as the ability to withstand this curse is varied person to person. I myself have experienced it and was unable to break it. However, as you've seen, Mr. Tempest seems to have the knack. Why is that? Sirius asked. Barton looked at Harry thoughtfully. Perhaps it is because he has a strong will, perhaps it is merely because he has experienced it in the past and has built up a feel for it. I can't really say. Mr. Tempest. Harry shrugged. The first time was when my professor put me under it. He did much of the same as you did, casting the curse on us and asking us to perform silly tasks. He told me to jump on a desk. But it didn't make sense to me, so I jumped and tried not to jump at the same time. Barton watched him speculatively. You managed to resist on your first attempt. That is indeed impressive. Who was your teacher? Harry paused. He was an older Professor Medea. Harry was quick to slur the last two words together. If he remembered rightly, Alastair Moody wouldn't even have his magical eye yet, so the man wouldn't likely make the connection. Barton was thoughtful. I'm not familiar with him. However, my lesson was based on some Aurora training exercises, so perhaps. Barton looked pensive for a moment before turning back to Harry. Perhaps if you explain your thought process while under the curse. Harry nodded. He turned towards Sirius, who had been listening with some interest. Well, I suppose the biggest thing to fight against is the feeling of calm that the curse gives you. You want to feel at ease so that you don't think about what you're doing. But if you know that such a state isn't right to begin with, that is half the battle. Then, I guess I just fight back against the voice in my head. Just argue right back. Sirius raised an eyebrow. So you want me to just argue with the voice in my head? He questioned. That's really supposed to help? Harry shrugged. Helps me. But how do you, like blast him across the room? Sirius pointed to Barton and made a sweeping gesture with his hand as he spoke. That's not really, I mean you don't need to do that, and I didn't the first couple times I broke it, Harry argued. Sirius frowned. Sounds kind of lame, argue with the voice in my head. That's your advice? Well, prepare yourself, Mr. Black, Imperio. Barton wasted no time in casting the unforgivable on the young wizard. Sirius's expression was interesting to watch. There was a definite sign of some debate raging. His eyes went hazy and he stood strangely rigid. It took almost a minute, but soon Sirius was dancing the waltz and singing a tune Harry wasn't familiar with. When the spell was released, Sirius groaned in frustration. You were fighting it, Barton said in an encouraging manner. Little good it did, Sirius muttered. He moved away from both his tutors and collapsed into a chair with a dark expression on his face. Did you argue? Harry asked. Sirius gave him a hard look. Yeah, I think. It's just, you're right, it feels nice to just enjoy the peace. Sirius shook his head and looked away. Maybe that is why I don't have much trouble, Harry admitted. Sirius looked at him strangely. What do you mean by that? I guess I just don't feel that way normally enough. You might want to try and think about all the reasons that you don't feel that way. Remember your problems, your secrets. Harry felt strangely like he was back in the D.A. teaching once again. Sirius nodded his head, looking out the window. Ready, Mr. Black? Barton asked. Sirius nodded, a somewhat hesitant look on his face. Go for it, he said without much animation. Imperio, Barton cast. Once again Sirius seemed to fight the curse for a few moments before following Barton's every order. As the lesson progressed, Sirius attempted 5 more times, eventually fighting the curse for over a minute, but never managing to break it. Once Harry suggested that Barton instruct Sirius to do something that the young man would not willingly do in his natural state. Harry wondered if the performer and prankster in Sirius may have made him less opposed to making a fool of himself. Barton then instructed Sirius to confess about a prank he had pulled. Harry seemed to be correct. Sirius was never closer to breaking the curse than when he attempted to disobey that order. But Barton and Harry still learned that Sirius had been responsible for dosing some of the Slytherin students' juice at dinner this evening, in another attempt to get revenge for Peter. Let us say that the Slytherin bathrooms would be a popular place this evening. 10 points and detention, Mr. Black, Barton decreed once the boy was free of the curse. That isn't fair, Sirius cried. You wouldn't have known if you hadn't been casting unforgivables on me. Barton gave his student a hard look. Many men have been forced to do unforgivable things under these curses, Mr. Black. Be thankful your actions only resulted in detention. Sirius only glared after that, not saying anything. I think we've had enough for tonight, the defense professor stated. Harry nodded. Sirius made no gesture to the others in the room, just rose to his feet and left. Night, Harry said. Good night, Mr. Tempest, Barton acknowledged before returning to his desk and the essays he'd been grading earlier. Harry found himself jogging through the halls of Hogwarts to catch up with Sirius. Hey, he called when he was near enough. Sirius didn't bother turning around. What do you want? He asked sourly. Nothing, he he said, not knowing even why he'd bothered to chase after Sirius. It wasn't as if they were going to have a good chat, still he felt compelled to try. That was rough, huh? Sirius turned around rapidly. I don't need this from you, Tempest, he growled. Harry paused at the anger in his words. Okay, and another thing, we aren't friends. Outside of lessons I don't want you to talk to me, look at me, don't even act like you know me. Understand? Sirius was panting somewhat, his face flushed in anger. Harry couldn't build up the will to be angry. Yeah, sure, he said. Maybe it was how Harry had said it, maybe it was the tone or the body language, but Sirius's expression seemed to calm some. He licked his lips and opened his mouth, then shook his head in a decisive fashion. Without saying another word he turned on his heel and continued his swift pace back to the common room. Harry let the distance grow between them. It was coming on curfew and he should be rushing back as well. But back to what? To spending time with his dead mother. To watching betrayers and betrayed sit side by side. But he didn't have any other choice. For the first time he almost wished that his magic was overflowing. It would be very nice to hide away in the room of requirement for a few hours and let his training regimen wash over him and leave him hollow. But his magic was calm. It's almost time for curfew, Mr. Potter, said a familiar voice. Harry turned around, smiling softly. Good evening, Headmaster, he greeted. Indeed, the man nodded. I've just been called by Professor Barton. He seems quite. The man hesitated for a moment, impressed by your ability with the unforgivable curses. Harry shrugged. I was sort of wondering how long it would take for him to contact you. Albus smiled faintly. Indeed, only moments after your lesson with Mr. Black. Mitchell decided to pay me a little visit. He was concerned about the familiarity you have with these curses. Harry paused. You don't want me to explain that, do you? No indeed, Mr. Potter, Albus agreed. I think we both know that it would be better for me to know no more. I'm already having Professor Slughorn brew a forgetfulness potion for the entirety of Hogwarts for when you leave. I believe the recipe calls for one of your hairs. I'll no doubt be asking for one at some point. Dumbledore strolled through the halls with Harry as he spoke, a light and cheerful tone to his voice despite the seriousness of the situation. Harry grinned. Just so long as it isn't polyjuice he's brewing. Dumbledore looked thoughtful. We already have 2 James Potters roaming the halls. I think that should be sufficient. They reached the Gryffindor common room and stood for a moment beside the fat lady who was snoozing in her frame. Her soft snore was the only noise in the corridor. Harry, Dumbledore said softly, I'm starting to believe that this may be a very painful trip for you, and that you are carrying a large burden by being here and remaining silent. I wish there was something I could do, my boy, the old man said with a sad tone. He patted the boy's shoulder, his eyes seemed duller in some way. Harry nodded. It's all right, sir. His protest was half-hearted. Dumbledore nodded. Good luck, young man, and good night. The headmaster turned and walked down the hall. Night, Harry called after him. Watching the professor for a moment, Harry turned and prodded the fat lady. Mesopotamia, no reaction. Hey, I need to get in, he said. She huffed grumpily. Well, all right then. With bleary eyes she swung open. Harry entered the Gryffindor common room, looking around to see most of the students playing wizarding games or chatting and laughing with friends. It was a Friday night and the students of the past weren't behaving any differently than the student of Harry's time. No one seemed to have a book out, but then this wasn't Ravenclaw. Harry knew that the impending weekend probably wouldn't have stopped Hermione. Now there was a Gryffindor that believed in serious studying. Harry caught a glimpse of Lily. The redhead reminded him of his bushy-haired friend in many ways. However, Lily was seen without a book in sight. She was chatting with Frank and Alice. Although Harry thought he caught the slightest hint of tension in her readable face, there was something very third wheel about her position among that grouping. Harry approached with a grin. Hey, he said with a warmly. Lily smiled in response. Harry, was there some relief in her tone? Hello, Harry, Alice greeted, and what was good boy like yourself doing coming in a little past curfew? She smiled cheekily as she spoke. Harry found himself feeling just as teasing in response, and whoever said I was a good boy? The blonde laughed and Frank smiled warmly. He did toss a teacher about the room, the older boy added. And walk out of a class, Lily said with a frown. Harry shrugged. What can I say? Girls love the bad boys. Everyone laughed at that comment, perhaps a little too hard. Hey, it wasn't that funny, Harry protested. Lily patted his shoulder in a condescending way. Don't worry, I'm sure some girls are mad about you. In fact, I think I see Hortense headed this way. Harry subconsciously seemed to flinch and looked around nervously, and if the would-be fangirl was about to descend from the ceiling. People laughed again and Harry found himself joining them. "So you're Hortense's latest attempt," Frank said with raised eyebrows. "So she's already made a circuit, has she?" Harry asked. He settled himself in one of the nearby armchairs. Frank nodded. "Indeed. Her family is sort of famous for attempting to marry better. Her grandmother was a Muggle-born who married into the Penting family, and her mother was a half-blood who married into the Muller family." Harry seemed unimpressed. "Should I know them?" Frank shrugged. Alice, who was sitting on his lap, toyed with his hair as he spoke. "It doesn't matter to me, but they are pretty important in the Ministry and the Wizengamot. I think Hortense is aiming for an even more impressive husband. I'm surprised she didn't wind up in Slytherin," Harry commented. Frank shook his head. "Clever and cunning isn't exactly part of her strategy. She's quite open with her intentions." Alice agreed with a nod. "Subtlety plays no part in her method." Then she changed gears with a soft smile. "So Harry, do you have a girlfriend? If you did, we could try and chase her off." Harry shook his head. "I don't have time for girlfriends," he said, thinking of the comatose Voldemort and the war that awaited him back home. Alice raised an eyebrow. "Time?" she inquired, her expression doubtful. Lily, however, was nodding. "See, I've tried to tell her the same thing. My parents didn't get married until they were both into their 30s. There is plenty of time for dating and such after Hogwarts and after we figure out what we want to do with our lives." Harry found himself looking at his mother curiously. While he didn't know much about her and his father's courtship, outside the fact that it had started in their 7th year, he could do the math and knew that he was scheduled to be born in only a few years. "So you're planning on having kids when you're 30? Harry asked. Lily shrugged. "Maybe, I mean that sort of thing can wait, you know." Alice, however, was shaking her head, not believing a word her friend spoke. "There she goes trying to sound all logical and practical. Lily Evans, somewhere inside you is a romantic that is just dying to get out." Lily rolled her eyes. "You always say that. Because I'm your best friend and I know you," the blonde argued. "And when you get over this little phase of yours, you and I can both get married and have kids at the same time. And our kids can be friends and we'll get together every week and have dinner and complain about how many kids we have and how messy they are, and how much we'll miss them when they go to Hogwarts." Alice sounded a little dreamy about the fantasy she'd woven. Harry cast a glance at Frank, wondering if the 7th year was a little concerned about his girlfriend's plans, but Longbottom seemed to have a sappy smile on his face as well. He decided to look at Lily, and there he also found a somewhat thoughtful face, one which she was trying to hide, but failed. "Doesn't that sound like a nice little life?" Alice asked the group. Frank nodded. "But you forgot the dog." Alice turned to him, brushing his cheeks softly. "No, I didn't. A big gold retriever. And you forgot the successful jobs. An Auror for Frank, a healer for you, and charms creator for me. What do you want to be, Harry?" Lily asked, including him in their fantasy. Professional Quidditch player," he said with a grin. It wasn't actually where he'd likely end up. The world would ask more of him. But if it were the sweet little silly world that they imagined, that would be a fun thing to do. Lily seemed to want to say something but shrugged. "All right, professional Quidditch for you. Are you that good?" Frank asked, his face a trifle serious. Harry smiled. "On a broom I'm unstoppable." He buffed his nails on his shirt with a playfulness that made the others snicker. Lily muttered something that sounded like, "Not another one." But Harry pretended not to hear. "In all seriousness, I'm a pretty good seeker." Frank nodded with a smile. "James Potter and I are going to be captains of a match tomorrow. Probably mostly just the 6th and 7th years, people from the team. But if you're as good as you say." Frank grinned a little devilishly. "I'll have an advantage to pick you. No one knows how good you are yet." Harry smiled too. Brill. Be it the future or the past, Harry Potter knew that getting on a broom and playing his favorite game could remove much of his worries and concerns. The four chatted for a little while longer. Finally Frank and Alice seemed a little preoccupied with each other and they drifted away to sit by the fire while Harry and Lily played a Muggle card game that both knew. Lily had even produced the Muggle deck, summoning them from her dorm room. "It's nice to have someone to play with," she confessed. "Alice is a half-blood but she was raised the wizard way. She really should take Muggle studies, because honestly some of her misconceptions are atrocious. She came over to my house in the summer and I think she destroyed our toaster. She also spent a few minutes trying to talk to the people on the TV. That was funny. Of course my sister thought she was a freak and didn't want to meet her." Harry nodded and Lily rambled away. He glanced behind her with a slight grin. A black-haired boy seemed to be taking notice of their conversation. I tried to teach Alice go fish, because that is probably the easiest one to learn, and she kept on wanting to know when the fish were going to appear, and then she said that the king and queen was scary because they just stared at her and didn't move, no matter how much she prodded them. Yeah, I know, Harry said. I taught Ron the game Hangman, and at first he kept arguing that it was a gruesome game because it was about public execution, and then he was disappointed when he learned we weren't actually going to see someone suffocated. He still hasn't gotten how to use phrases. Lily smiled. I feel sort of sad for the wizards who don't get to learn about some of the great things muggles can do, she said. Harry looked behind Lily once again. James had been slowly inching forward for the last few minutes, very obviously trying to overhear their conversation. I'm sure they'd like to learn, Harry suggested, knowing full well that James was within hearing distance now. Lily shrugged. Most purebloods just seem to assume that anything muggle is a waste of time. Harry purposefully glanced at James with a very obvious nod. Did the boy really need a better invitation? That's not true. James entered the conversation, or stumbled rather. I mean, I'm very curious about muggle culture, and muggleborns. He added a leering grin at the end of his sentence. Harry closed his eyes wearily. I think I'm going to bed, Lily announced. Wait, James said, I really would like to learn more about muggles. Take muggle studies, Lily said, rising to her feet. She nodded to Harry before hurrying up the girls' staircase, and the keeper blocks another attempt. Sirius called from across the room. James sat in the chair that Lily had just left. His leg jerked out and kicked the chair across from him. What am I doing wrong? He moaned. Harry thought this was time to offer a little fatherly advice, and no, he did realize how backward this situation was. But having Hermione for a friend had given him a little insight into the female psyche, and James was in desperate need of a little guidance. It's the way you talk to her, he advised. What? How do I talk to her? James asked. He'd sat up some and was looking at Harry in a skeptical way. Harry couldn't help but cringe. He was venturing into the disgusting, like you just want to shag her, he said bluntly. How am I supposed to talk to her? James was honestly perplexed. Wow, was really hoping for a denial there, Harry said with a little jerk. He leaned back in his chair and really tried to convince himself that the sack of hormones before him wasn't his father. It would have been more convincing if they didn't look so much alike. No, well, I like her too. James tugged at his collar as he spoke. It was obviously less embarrassing to want to shag Lily as opposed to actually liking her. Well then, talk to her like you like her, like she's a friend, like she's serious. You want me to mock her and call her an idiot? James scratched his head. No, Harry said, better take this slow. Talk to her like she's a person and be interested in what she has to say. Try and take an interest in what she's interested in. James was nodding, which was good because Harry didn't think he could offer any more advice. This was just wrong on many levels. He didn't want to play Cupid for this parents. That just seemed to raise too many time travel questions and paradox issues. Not to mention the fact that while he wanted to be born, he didn't really want to hear a lot about the process that had achieved that goal. James gave him an approving look. That's pretty smooth, he said with an admiring grin. But then I guess you have to get inventive when you look, well, like that. Harry raised an eyebrow. We're almost identical. James ran a hand through his hair. You only wish, he said with a grin. As the leader of the Marauders walked away, Harry was starting to see why Dumbledore had placed him with the Dursleys to keep his ego from being inflated by an adoring wizarding world. If his personality had been much like his father's, he would need more chains than a muggle blimp to keep him tethered to reality. It was getting late. Harry rose to his feet for a moment. The seventh year, Ethan, gestured for Harry to join in another game of cards, but Barty was among the players and Harry didn't feel up to another encounter with the future Death Eater. He yawned and silently declined with a nod. Harry crossed the room and up the stairs and into his dorm room. His lack of sleep from the other night catching up to him, he eagerly crawled into bed, pulling the covers around him and almost instantly dropping asleep. Almost. For a moment he found himself drifting back to the conversation earlier this evening. Alice's picture-perfect word was a nice illusion. A world where he and Neville could have grown up best friends, grown up in a world where both parents were alive and sane, a world with brothers and sisters and a home with a dog. Harry knew that none of that would happen. Somewhere along the way Alice would decide to become an Auror, giving up healing. Harry didn't know why she'd do that. And Lily would put her future plans aside to join her husband in working for the Order of the Phoenix. Harry knew that the pot of wealth allowed both Potters to dedicate themselves to the light's cause. Had his mother still dreamed of one day becoming a charms creator? It wouldn't matter, he supposed. Alice and Frank were driven into madness. Lily and James were murdered. And because of Voldemort, that pretty little future, the one they had dreamed up tonight, none of that would ever be. The room was dark, but not ill-lit. Candelabras with tallow candles ringed the walls. But the room was painted black. There was little other decoration. Black walls, a simple straight-backed chair and those candelabras that looked like snakes. It was perhaps what might be called a comfortable room. Everything looked to be in good condition. Even the air smelled clean and fresh despite the lack of windows. He stood with his hands resting on the backs of the chairs, his palms resting elegantly atop each other. A figure was crouched before him, on his knees, his head bowed. "The preparations are going well, my lord," the man said. "We have secured an entire squadron to be ready. As well as 2 of your own groups have been prepared." "Good," he said. There was pleasure in that one statement. The man relaxed. "Don't be so tense, Lestrange, you have my confidence." The man seemed to avoid a smile. He stepped down and placed a hand on the kneeling man's shoulder. "Go now, send McNair in. I believe he's found something I've been looking for." The man nodded, rising to his feet and sweeping from the room with swift, elegant movements. In only a few moments another man joined. "Master," the man said. He would have bowed, but he was only able to manage a nod of the head, seeing as he was busy with the struggling package he brought. "Ah, and was there much trouble?" he asked in a disinterested manner. "Some, my lord, but I live to serve." McNair's voice was hoarse and wheezy. With a dismissive gesture he tossed his cargo to the floor. "Good, leave us." He raised his wand and stepped slowly across the room. The bundle had stopped moving, seeming to listen to his footsteps with a slight quaking. When he was near enough he waved his wand and without a sound the black cloth that covered the package's head released. The object in question was in fact a man. He was an older man, well into his 50s and had been aging poorly. His hair was already white and he was mostly bald on top. His face was lined and his cheeks were somewhat hollow. His eyes were of a silvery shade that was unusual. They were the sort of thing that people noticed and remembered. When he was a child, those around him had said that it meant he had the magical sight. "Hello, Max," he said to this lump of a man. "Tom. I always knew." The man muttered, refusing to look up. "Yes, you had a nasty little habit of knowing," he said disdainfully. "I knew, I saw it." He smiled. It seemed somewhat unnatural and twisted, not how a smile should look at all. "Yes, you saw. And you said nothing. For all these years you've said nothing." "Yes, nothing. I promise you, I've said nothing." The man was blubbering now. A mixture of relief and desperation all mixed together. "Lies. I know you spoke with Dumbledore. How much did you say?" For the first time since he'd been released from the bag the man looked up. He looked up and what little color his face had left him. His hand came to his mouth and he looked upward with a sense of revulsion. "What have you done? How could you have?" the man stuttered in fear, his eyes taking in the scene before him as if he was witnessing something foul and mangled. "Have you finally seen enough?" The question was mocking and the man on the floor began to cry. He cried quietly, the tears dripping down his thin chin and onto his collar. There was no sound for a moment, just the hushed breathing echoing around the room. "You're going to kill me, aren't you, Tom?" He was oddly calm as he said this, the trembling vanishing from his body. "You always knew, didn't you?" He raised his hand and this time he spoke the words, Avada Kedavra. The man, the package, Max, they all creased to be in that instant. Slumping to the ground, those odd silver eyes lost all their light. And the sight brought such a sense of peace, such utter relief. He sat in the chair and smiled, really smiled. In Scotland a boy opened his eyes and flung himself forward. He was still wrapped in his blankets. He fought against the covers, pushing them onto the floor. He felt suffocated, as if the air was somehow thicker. He got to his feet, moving to the window that was beside his bed and flinging it open so that cool night air swept around him, sending goosebumps on his bare arms and chest. But it felt good and he breathed the air in hungrily. He didn't need to see that. Why was he even seeing it? He didn't have a connection to this Voldemort. This Voldemort was a man who hadn't yet felt that icy brush of death. This was a man who hadn't heard a prophecy of his own demise, who hadn't, at seemingly random, chosen a child and decided to execute it. He should not have to see this man. But like so many things that he shouldn't have to bear, the weight was still left on his shoulders. Where was it fair that the first time he could hear his parents' voices was when he heard them being murdered? Life wasn't fair for Harry Potter, he should just accept that by now. You alright? A voice posed. Harry jerked. Remus? He asked. The werewolf stood behind him slightly. Yeah, you sounded like you were having a nightmare, muttering in your sleep. I was thinking about waking you. Harry ran a hand along his still prickling scar. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. His ministrations to his scar became nervous gesture, ruffling his hair. It's all right. I'm a light sleeper. It seems like every time someone knocks over a pillow I wake up. Harry knew that it was really Lupin's sensitive ears. While they might make dorm life troublesome, Harry supposed that they had come in handy while he was a professor. He couldn't recall anyone managing to successfully prank him, not even the twins. Harry's silence had caused the young prefect to look at him closely. Well, if you're all right. Harry nodded. Yeah, I'm fine. Remus returned to his bed, but Harry had no intention of doing the same. Instead he softly walked out the dorm room and closed the door behind him. He entered the common room and looked around, his eyes meeting the clock. It was only a little past 1, not very late at all. Indeed, even a few students were still awake. Harry saw a couple before the fire as well as 4 younger boys who were playing a wizard board game that Harry wasn't familiar with. However, the candles that lit the room brightly had been doused at midnight, only the warm glow for the fireplaces remained. Harry made his way over to a dark corner and let his head lay back, closing his eyes. He was tired, but these visions or dreams always seemed to make him not want to sleep. He supposed that wasn't an irrational reaction. After all, few people would really want to wander into the mind of a psychopath during their nightly hours. But the dream was becoming fuzzy now, as they always did. Something was happening, and it made Voldemort happy. Not a good thing then. And then that man, what had his name been? He and Voldemort seemed to know each other. The man had even called the Dark Lord by his real name. Harry rubbed his forehead tiredly. It was hard to pretend it didn't matter. So odd that he had watched the death of another human being, unable to stop it. He had no power over what Voldemort did. This man was dead. Indeed, from Harry's place in time this stranger had been dead for some time, years in fact. So it shouldn't matter. Yes, it was hard to pretend. Day 4, things can only get better at this point, right? Morning, did you sleep here all night, silly boy? The voice was very loud and made him feel annoyed, although he didn't know why. Harry tried to move, but for some reason that his bed was smaller than he remembered. He felt penned in, and to add to his discomfort something seemed to be brushing across his face. His eyes jerked open, and what he saw was both comforting and also a little unpleasant. The room was comfortable, the company wasn't. Hortense's hand was still close to his face. Harry found himself pulling back. Hello, he said for the lack of anything better to say. Hortense smiled. Hello, did you sleep in the common room? Harry sat up and the girl backed away slightly. She toyed with her brown curly hair and flashed a smile. I guess I did, Harry admitted. I better go and Harry glanced down. He'd sort of forgotten that his only pajamas didn't come with a shirt. Hortense had already noticed. That sort of explained the smile. Harry got to his feet and was headed toward the staircase when the girl caught up to him. Harry, what are you doing today? Because I bet you haven't been given a proper tour of Hogwarts. Harry waved his hands quickly. I'm playing Quidditch, he offered. But thanks, I think I can find my way around the school. He nodded in her direction, fleeing the mostly empty common room with quick steps. Hortense Muller sighed in a disappointed way. She knew she should have let him sleep a little longer. Up in her dorm, Lily Evans was sleeping peacefully. One of her guilty pleasures was a love of sleeping late on the weekends. Even if she didn't sleep, she often stayed abed until past 10, and would possibly have stayed even later, but breakfast wasn't served after 10:30. Lily rolled over and opened her eyes slowly. She cuddled into her blankets and pillows, enjoying her first Saturday at Hogwarts. At home her mother always insisted that she be up by 9, so in some ways she always looked forward to returning to school. On the negative side, well, there was James Potter. On the positive end, there were lazy Saturday mornings. Life was all about balance. Oh Maggie, I knew it was right to get up early. A voice invaded the quiet of her dorm and Lily was seriously considering casting a silencing charm. Maggie was a short girl with black hair that came to her chin. She was the athletic type, and a reserve chaser for the Gryffindor team. Despite this, she was also Hortense's friend. What? She asked. You always tease me about getting up early, the girl babbled on. It's because you do it so that you can do your makeup and curl your hair, Maggie said tiredly. Hortense shrugged, but today it finally paid off. Who do you think I spied in the common room, and without a shirt? Is Maisie Reynolds stripping again? I know she said that it was only because someone switched her butterbeer for fire whiskey, but... No, Hortense interrupted. Yuck. Why would I want to have to see that again? Number. It was Harry Tempest. Her voice took on a dreamy tone. That made Lily glad she hadn't cast the silencing charm. What was Harry doing half naked in the common room? It had better not be one of James Potter's pranks. She subtly shifted herself so that she could hear their conversation better. She could also just see them from between her partially closed curtains. Maggie was silent for a moment. Well, I wasn't expecting that. But oh well, good for you I suppose. Hortense huffed. You know you aren't being very supportive, she complained. Sorry, Maggie replied, it is just hard to understand this one. I get Black and Potter, they both are pretty powerful and come from good families. Even Parkinson wasn't a bad choice. But who is this Tempest guy anyway? A man with amazing shoulders, Hortense gushed. And he must be powerful, if he can break the Imperious curse. Maggie shrugged, if you say so. But he has an attitude, he walked out of class the other day. Hortense wasn't affected, all the great men do. Why did he leave do you know? He didn't want to read his essay aloud, about how the Cruciatus curse feels. I was sort of wondering if maybe it was a little too, you know, personal. Lily found herself confused. Why was there such emphasis on the word personal? Hortense grew quiet too. You don't think it was cast on him, do you? Maggie didn't answer. Let's go down to breakfast, I'm playing Quidditch today. Oh, that's why I really wanted to talk to you. Hortense followed her out the dorm. You have to tell me everything about Quidditch. Lily felt a little grumpy as she started to sit up. The dorm was empty. Normally this would be the perfect opportunity to enjoy a lazy sleepy morning. Alice was probably off with Frank. Maggie and Hortense had gone. Even Morgan was nowhere in sight. But she couldn't seem to get comfortable. What had Hortense and Maggie been talking about? It wasn't possible that Harry had refused to discuss the Cruciatus curse because it was too personal. She suddenly remembered something she had said. It's not like it's anything personal. Not like you've been under the Cruciatus yourself, but whatever. She shoved her face into her pillow. Suddenly she felt really stupid. What if she'd been wrong? It seemed utterly impossible though. Why would someone her age have experienced a torture curse? Who could possibly want to hurt Harry Tempest? Still, despite the improbability of it, she couldn't seem to get back to sleep. Lily found herself getting out of bed, and rummaging through her closet, shifting aside all the uniforms and finding some jeans and an old cream-colored jumper. The mornings were still cold at Hogwarts in September. When she entered the common room she spotted Remus standing before two second-years speaking seriously. She wandered towards him hoping to overhear, and while pranking is all well and good, he lectured, flooding the second-year dorm room is going a little out of line. I'll have to tell Professor McGonagall about this. Both boys looked a little pale and desperate about that. We'll dry everything up, the one said, the other quickly nodding. Remus seemed pensive. If you do it together. Well, all right. Both boys were relieved. What was that about? Lily asked once they had headed back upstairs. Remus heaved a sigh, just a little prank war emerging. Those two seem to fight more than any other people I've met. Well, excepting you and James, it will be punishment to have them work together, and you never know, they might learn to get along some. Lily nodded. Remus really could be sensible when he was away from his friends. Remus, have you seen Harry Tempest? She asked. The prefect nodded. He was heading to breakfast. I think he's planning on playing in Frank and James's Quidditch game. I just hope it doesn't get as out of hand as last year. They can be pretty competitive. We need a referee, Lily agreed. The pair exited the common room and began walking to the Great Hall. It was early enough that the halls weren't very crowded. Everything looked more colorful with students out of uniform, milling around in both wizarding wear and muggle clothing. Lily glanced upward at the windows they passed. It looked like it was going to be a beautiful day. The sun was streaming through the windows and only a few white clouds dotted the sky. It would be a good day for Quidditch. Now why did she think that? Lily wondered. Remus nodded. You're up early, he commented. Lily tried to shrug that fact away. She turned to Remus a little curiously. Remus, why do you think Harry walked out of defense yesterday? I hadn't given it much thought, he replied. Is there a reason? No, I guess not. I was just something Maggie said this morning. Well, you don't think he could, no personally. Remus's gaze became somewhat distant before turning back to Lily with a smile. Without asking for her to clarify, he said, no, of course not. Yeah, that is what I thought. Lily felt much more relieved now. On entering the great hall, the prefects broke apart. Remus heading to James and Sirius, who were up and eating large breakfasts. Peter was also there, for the first time waking up without a struggle. Quidditch put everyone in a good mood. Harry was sitting beside Frank and the two men seemed to be chatting happily. Alice was looking very bored and she grinned when Lily sat down. Good morning, the redhead greeted. Harry nodded. Yep, excellent day for Quidditch. Lily found herself laughing. Isn't it odd? That is what I thought. Alice groaned. Not another one. Lily, you don't even play Quidditch. Promise me you won't be nutty about it. Lily nodded. You know I'm not obsessed. But I do sort of like the game. I just don't like how competitive people get about it. That's part of the fun, Frank argued. Brace yourself, Longbottom. James called loudly from down the table. Get ready for your yearly beating, he proclaimed. You just be ready for humiliation, Potter. Frank returned. And there is begins, Lily said with a grimace. Frank grinned before taking a bite of his breakfast. It's all in good fun. Not long after breakfast, a group of students had gathered out by the Quidditch pitch. Most were Gryffindors, likely spurred on by the friendly rivalry James Potter and Frank Longbottom had started up. But a few Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws had joined as well. This game was something that James and Frank had started in James's second year. Harry listened as Remus explained it. Apparently James was a little sore that the Gryffindor Quidditch captain of the time didn't think that anyone under third year was good enough to make the team. But the rebellious second year wasn't about to let the chance to use a professional-size Quidditch pitch, like the one Hogwarts had, slide by. James and Frank had known each other before Hogwarts, both purebloods, both from light-sided families. They had gotten together a few times to play as children. And both were very fond of Quidditch. At first James and Sirius wanted to start the game, but with just our year there would never be enough people for a real game. The first year we just played the second-year dorm against the third years. Remus looked toward James and Frank, who were heckling each other. Frank of course becoming the captain of the older year, and James of our year. Over the last few years more people come, different years, different houses. James and Frank are still the captains, but they pick their players as opposed to just sticking with their year, Remus explained. Harry nodded. So the first weekend every year? He asked. Remus shrugged. Not necessarily. Last year Sirius managed to get detention for the first weekend, so we waited until he could play. Another year we all couldn't all meet until 5 or so weekends into the school year. The Quidditch teams were a little upset because they had already started practices and I guess some people broke into the broom shed. Remus smiled fondly. He turned to Harry. You do have a broom, don't you? Harry nodded. When he'd been packing his time travel survival trunk, he'd never have forgotten to take his broom. He had been forced to make a few careful alterations. There was an illusion charm that made his firebolt look like some of the current clean sweep models. Harry had been provided with many examples of the brooms of the period, considering that their dorm room was almost carpeted with Quidditch magazines. His broom would still move faster than the other brooms, so he'd have to be careful to match the other players as best as he could. There were some definite risks, but it was just too much temptation to avoid. A chance to play Quidditch with his dad. Harry smiled. Despite all the difficulties he'd found in this time, this sort of made up for it all. A few students lined up on the pitch. However, Harry noted that most of the crowd had moved to stands, obviously more interested in watching today's game than playing. Alice was there to cheer Frank on, Lily by her side. Remus and Peter seemed to have chosen the stands as well. There were also a few girls who seemed to be there for James and Sirius. Both hams were playing up the attention well. Some younger years, including a few first-year Muggleborns, had come, eager to see their first game of Quidditch. However, the stands soon melted into the background as the two captains took their spots in front. Frank and James stood before the others as if they were generals going into war. Age before beauty, James allowed, gesturing for Frank to pick first. The seventh year seemed to want to laugh about James's vanity, but instead coughed and took on a hardened look that made some of the prospective players nervous with excitement. Harry Tempest, Frank said. Harry was a little surprised, but quickly went to stand beside Frank. James looked a little suspicious. Just because we look alike doesn't mean he's as good as me, he said highly. Frank played it close to his vest. Your turn. Sirius, James called. The young pureblood grinned excitedly, marching up the front and slapping his friend on the back. Ethan, Neville said, calling his dorm mate to the front. Tobias Crane, James called, bringing up a third year who was rather small. He plays Seeker for Gryffindor, Ethan whispered. Maggie Winthrop, Frank called. A girl with short black hair nodded, standing next to Ethan with a familiarity. The taller seventh year smiled down at her. Nice to have you, Maggie. I thought James would nick you, especially with Franklin not here, Ethan said, leaning towards her. The girl flipped her short hair. He tends to underestimate girls, she answered. His loss, Ethan said, winking at her. Thurton Campton, James called, bringing up a tall broad boy who Ethan informed Harry was a beater for Hufflepuff. Morgan Winthrop, Frank called. Harry noticed another girl come forward. She was very similar to the previous, the same short black hair and slight but athletic build. Are you twins? Harry asked them. Maggie looked at him in an evaluating way that was a little unnerving. Fraternal, not identical, she stated. Morgan seemed to be the quieter of the two and only nodded. Sam Davis, James called, bringing another boy with a sandy-colored hair. Gryffindor chaser, Ethan added. And slow at turns, Maggie added. James and Franklin Bennett are the other Gryffindor chaser. I play reserve, she included for Harry's benefit. Do most of the team come to play at this game? Harry wondered aloud. Mostly, but then it is Quidditch. I think most of us would play regardless of who started the game, Maggie said with an excited grin stealing over her rather composed face. Harry nodded. Hector and Fort didn't show, Ethan said, looking around. They're probably in the hospital wing, Morgan mentioned softly. Why is that? Ethan questioned. I heard that they were arguing in potions again. Morgan turned to sister as she spoke. Ethan winced. How bad was the explosion? I didn't feel the ground shaking. Those idiots, Maggie decided. They work great when they're on the pitch, but the rest of the time they seem ready to kill each other. Remember the fight they had in the Great Hall? Ethan smiled. That was great. You didn't wind up with custard in your hair, Maggie argued with a sour expression. Ethan looked pensive. Actually, I think I did. Mac, Frank called. The redhead from the game of exploding snap approached. About time, he said, joining beside Ethan. Sorry mate, Frank said, had to get the best pair of chases while I could. The Winthrop sisters reacted to the comment, Maggie smiling and Morgan blushing. Frank plays keeper, so we only need another chaser, Mac said, looking at the people who were left. Thomas O'Neill, James called. Thomas was a wiry boy with black hair. He joined his place beside the others. Ravenclaw chaser, Maggie informed. And good. She looked thoughtful for a moment. Frank, Maggie moved to the captain and whispered something in his ear. Frank nodded. Chris Fletcher, a smaller boy, probably a fourth year, moved to their side. Smart choice, Mac commented. Ravenclaw chaser, if anyone can predict O'Neill's movements it would be his teammate. And vice versa, Harry added. There is that, Maggie agreed. But he's a good chaser too. Scored quite bit last year for only starting in the middle of the season after Frobisher was injured. Thanks, you're not bad yourself, Chris said, winking at Maggie as he spoke. Maggie smiled and looked him square in the eye, not intimidated by a woman that plays Quidditch. She asked the younger and shorter boy. Morgan nudged her sister. Chris smiled, a beautiful girl who is awesome at Quidditch. Marry me, he teased. Maggie laughed. I knew you were the right choice. She swung an arm around his shoulder and laughed while her sister seemed too flustered to comment. James meanwhile had examined the rest carefully. Damien Forrester, he called. And so the teams were divided. Those who hadn't been picked for a team moaned incompliant, but most weren't too surprised. It was a given that the players for the house teams would be given first pick. Perhaps the only real surprise had been Frank's choice of Harry Tempest. Frank gathered his team in a circle. Ethan and Mac are our beaters. Maggie, Morgan and Chris can handle the quaffle. I'll protect our goal, and Harry, it's up to you to catch the snitch. But let's just have fun and beat James Potter's ego back to a reasonable size. Everyone grinned at the comment. And Harry, Frank pulled the younger man aside for a moment. Watch Thurton and Sirius, they can get a little reckless when they play beater. The last time we played, my Seeker broke his arm. It's just supposed to be a fun rivalry, but sometimes I think it takes on a life of its own. Harry could tell that the seventh year was still feeling guilty about his last Seeker. Don't worry on a broom, I'm pretty uncatchable. Frank nodded. The two teams took to the air and Harry reveled in the feeling of the wind whipping through his hair, enjoying the weightless feeling that seemed to happen whenever he took off and soared high above the pitch. Soared a little too fast actually. Harry looked around but no one seemed to have noticed. Everyone was waiting for the toss-up. Harry looked below and watched the other players moving around. He knew that their brooms had to move at about half the speed that his could. He just hoped he remembered that when it came time to chase the snitch. A figure flew up beside him. It was the young seeker Tobias Crane. Harry nodded at him pleasantly, Crane responding with a mid-air somersault and a raised eyebrow. Harry grinned. He'd played Seeker enough to know that half the game was mental. If you could intimidate your opponent, then you stood a better chance of winning. But it took more than some impressive aerial displays to intimidate him. Harry merely gazed steadily at the younger Seeker, then looked down when he heard a whistle. The quaffle was up and James Potter had immediately taken control. Not for nothing was he considered the king of Quidditch. Harry found himself a little mesmerized by the sight of his father playing. Sirius had told him that he'd inherited his father's talent with a broom, and it was true. Harry could tell that James felt comfortable on a broom. Even from here he could see that much of his father's posturing was cast aside when he was flying. Like Harry, he seemed to leave his troubles on the ground. But Harry thought that his father's flaying and his own were different too. Maybe it was just because James was a chaser, and Harry a seeker. Tactics had to be different after all. James flew with a quick sort of confidence. Moving agilely through the other players, he seemed to have no knowledge of potential danger. Harry hovered high above everything, his body alert, ready for anything. Maybe it was because James Potter hadn't dodged rogue bludgers seeking to injure him, or fought jinxed bucking broomsticks, or had a squad of Dementors enter the pitch. Quidditch was wonderful. Harry loved everything about it. But like with everything else in his life, he'd learned to take the good with the bad. A flicker of gold caught his attention and Harry moved towards where Frank was guarding the hoops. But it turned out to be the sheen from a copper hairclip that Morgan was wearing. Maggie seemed to have taken the quaffle and both her and her sister moved rapidly, passing between each other so smoothly that it seemed the twins could read each other's minds. They reached the hoops and Maggie threw the ball, but it was quickly blocked by the keeper Damien Forrester. He had caught the ball squarely in his palms and tossed it to James as the chaser flew by. A bludger came Harry's way and he was forced to roll. Ethan hurried over. "How you doing?" he asked. Harry nodded. "Just be careful, all right," Ethan encouraged. "And don't catch the snitch too soon. Want to play this game for a bit." But there was no chance of ending the game too soon. The snitch seemed eager to be outside and play and was making no effort to be found. Both Harry and Tobias were getting a little bored. At one point Harry had bulleted through the other team's defenses, giving Maggie a path to score. It was a maneuver that he had used from time to time on his team at home. It was just natural for people to move out of the way of a fast-moving object. Not that he was going that fast. Harry really wanted to have the chance to let his firebolt out, but he knew that he had to keep up appearances. James's team was dominating the scoreboard. James and Sam Davis were both chasers on the Gryffindor team. Together they could implement some snazzy tactics to score. Maggie and Morgan worked amazingly well together, but Morgan wasn't as confident as her sister and didn't play on the house team, so she was a little rusty skill-wise. The two Ravenclaw chasers seemed pretty busy just competing against each other. Harry didn't know, but he thought there might be some disagreement between the two, or at least it looked that way judging by their fierce attitudes. Harry was drifting by James's hoops when he once again caught a gold shine. He moved his head slowly, keeping the shin within his eyeline but not moving his head too obviously. Crane had been marking him closely for much of the game. Not too near. Sirius and Thurton did seem to go out of their way to target him. Crane couldn't get too close or risk being hit by his own beaters. There was the shine again. Now he could tell it was the snitch. It almost looked like it was floating harmlessly on the breeze near Frank's goal. Harry turned an eye on Crane. The younger boy hadn't spotted it yet. He was also a little closer. Harry slowly moved towards Frank's end of the pitch. He was even with Crane when the other seeker spotted it. Harry had been keeping one eye on him, the other on the snitch. The seeker's expression had given it all away. Harry flattened himself on his broom. He moved quickly toward the snitch. Crane soon matched him, both seekers shoulder to shoulder. Crane used his upward angle to bash into Harry. It really wasn't the best move. While not much larger, Harry did have at least 5 inches and 10 pounds on Crane. He absorbed the blow, knocking his own shoulder into the other seeker. Crane was pushed off course a bit, but managed to catch up. However, his attempt to check Harry had lost him a few inches. He lowered his face on his broom, trying to catch up on his speed. Both seekers were nearing the snitch when suddenly the small ball seemed to discover that it had been sighted. The winged ball dropped lower and sped towards James's goals. Harry tucked into a Quidditch move known as a tight roll. It allowed the seeker to change direction at an almost 90-degree angle. His speed didn't change much and he was soon diving lower, moving jerkily to keep with the flying ball's movement. He was soon almost within reaching distance, his arm was out and ready to grab. But the snitch changed direction again, stopping almost dead and dropping lower. There was only one thing for it. Harry stopped abruptly as well, dropping to the side and allowing his knees to wrap around the handle. He swung upside down, snatching the snitch from where it fluttered just above the grass. As Harry pulled himself back up, he became aware that there had been a crowd watching. He'd forgotten about the students that had gathered to watch the game. It was only now that he considered them. Their cheers filled air. For the distance he thought he could see his mother, her face excited and happy, jumping up and down, and she cheered his name. Yeah, this trip was all worthwhile. Soon, however, that noise was drowned out when the other members of Harry's team collided on him. Frank was thumping his back, probably harder than was necessary. Ethan was flying around in circles cheering at the top of his lungs. Chris Fletcher seemed to enjoy gloating a bit in front of his fellow Ravenclaw, and the Winthrop sisters hugged each other and flew around the pitch. Maggie soon flew down to Harry, tugging on his arm to lead him on a triumphant circle of the pitch. Chris, Ethan and Morgan soon joined in, everyone circling high above the pitch cheering their win. Once Frank had finished congratulating Harry, the seventh year moved on to James Potter. Despite the age difference, James had won 3 out of the 4 matches, and the older Frank had been hungry for another win. James didn't wear defeat well. He still couldn't believe what had happened. They had been leading by 100 points, victory had seemed so sure. He listened to Frank's crowing with as much dignity as he could muster, finally shaking the other captain's hand before flying to the ground. The rest of his team was also grumpy. Thurton still had one bludger handy. He tossed it in the air and swung with his bat aimlessly. Damn it, he cursed sullenly. Despite his low spirits, the bat hit true, sending the metal ball in a high arch across the pitch, flying directly towards the celebrating team. Harry was still being patted on the bat when he heard the whistling. He noticed it in a vague way, not quite understanding why the noise seemed to fill him with a trace of worry. We did it. Mac shouted. Merlin, I'm glad, the redhead cheered. Whack, ahhh, from somewhat behind him the noise rang through the air. Everyone turned in a stunned manner to see Morgan. She had been flung off her broom and was plummeting to the ground. Her dark hair swirled around her panicked face. Most stood for a moment too surprised to do anything. Harry's reflexes were spot on. Without a thought, Harry kicked his broom to the highest speed he could manage, trying to fly faster than Morgan was falling. The wind whipped past his face, forcing his eyes into slits, while his mind tried to do the math. They had been at least 50 feet up when she'd fallen. If he pushed just a little harder, Harry managed to sweep under Morgan, her body landing hard against his chest and sliding down until she straddled his legs at an odd angle. Her hands had wrapped around his head, clinging onto him for dear life. You're okay, Harry muttered, trying to speak between her hands. Morgan seemed to notice this. She lowered her hands a bit, wrapping him around his shoulder as he lowered them slowly to the ground. When they finally touched down, Morgan burst into tears. Somehow being safe allowed all the emotion to hit her. Maggie wasn't far behind. The normally confidant sister was shaking, her eyes rimming with tears. Maury, she said, wrapping her arms around her sister as much as she could. Morgan was still clutching Harry's arm, her other arm cradled her abdomen. Maggie still managed to wrap around her sister. Mag, Morgan said hoarsely. It's okay. She looked up at Harry. You saved her. The other members of their team had also joined now. Everyone looked a little pale. Thurton ran over as well. He'd gotten off his broom and had only just noticed what had happened. Hey, you okay? He asked nervously. Ethan jumped off his own broom, still 3 feet off the ground. What was that? He demanded. I didn't. He was silenced when Maggie broke away from her sister and slugged the taller 7th year in the mouth. Considering Thurton was a good foot taller than her and nearly twice as broad, she must have put her full fist into it as he staggered back. It's just a game. She shouted. You have fun knocking little girls off their brooms, Mac said, standing beside Maggie, looking like he was ready to take his own swing. Seeing as Mac and Thurton were about the same size, that might be a different sort of fight. The game was over, Chris said, his face red and furious. Sirius, James and Frank were running across the pitch, trying to figure out what had happened. What's going on? James asked as he approached. He tossed a bludger at her, Ethan explained, pointing to Morgan who was still clutching onto Harry and her stomach. Tears still ran down her eyes but she was silent now, although she did look a bit green. James turned to Thurton with an angry look as well. Is that what happened? No, Thurton quickly argued through his already bloody lip. Why you bastard, Ethan said, cocking his fist. Frank darted in between, holding his friend back. I hit a bludger, but I wasn't aiming at anyone, the seventh-year Hufflepuff said quickly. Is she all right? His concern was obvious. Thanks to Harry, Morgan said tightly, her voice still sounding upset. You caught her from only 50 feet, Max said. He seemed to have only just realized this and was looking at Harry in awe and shock. How'd you do that? You both should be splattered into the pitch. I just did, Harry said. Morgan looked up at him. Thank you, she said softly, still not letting go of his arm. A new group was approaching. Alice and Lily from up in the stands had darted across the field and was soon standing beside the two sisters. Are you all right? Lily asked. I think she needs a healer, Harry said, noticing the way that Morgan still clutched at her ribs. Alice nodded. She quickly conjured a stretcher and Morgan was floated off the field. Maggie walked beside her, holding her sister's hand. Lily ran up ahead, no doubt to make sure that Madame Pomfrey would be ready for the injured Quidditch player. The rest were left behind, the happiness from a moment ago washed away. Harry stood awkwardly before deciding to follow the girls up the school. He didn't need to turn around to know that the others were watching him as he walked away.